Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back once again. Agenda number 4, Part A2, Impairment Assessment. So, let's start with the reading of requirement. Using Exhibit 1, explain how auto company means parent should assess, verb is assess, whether goodwill of subsidiary, that's trailer, is impaired according with IAS 36 impairment of asset. Calculation are not required. And same Exhibit 1. Here the requirement is more about to explain the principle with the consideration of case. But make sure, before attacking, before entering into war, you must have a great plan. Number one, plan your answer. Plan with respect to time. You have 5 marks question, total 9 minutes. You need to invest 20% time for planning. Planning includes reading, understanding requirement, and brainstorming the key points. Whatever you are going to write, before write, make up brainstorming. What I will write for 5 marks. What 3 or 4 points I should write, make a brainstorming. Ideally, for if you have 9 minutes and you need to invest for 20% time for planning, that means 2 minutes you can invest for planning. Students, you must have to do this. So first thing is about, think about time. Number 2, marks. Ask yourself, have you read the requirement carefully and facts as well? With this requirement, there is nothing the role about facts, because there is nothing the discussion about indication that's mentioned on the case. Here just examiner use the verb assess. How to assess the impairment of subsidiary's goodwill. So read the requirement, that's about only calculation, verb, facts from the exhibit, but here the facts are not much available for this requirement. Number 2, you have identified explanation. Don't forget the application. Don't forget application. Drafting rules, as we already discussed with the regular course. Drafting rules. First, explanation of the principle. Use your own wordings. Then apply, that means connect with the case. Always organize your draft with this sequence: explain and apply. Or you can draft your answer with the condensed wordings, simultaneously explanation with application. It's allowed. It's not always necessary to mention first para explanation, second para, or first para explanation, second para application. You have to make 2 paras, simultaneously explanation and connection with the case. Don't worry, it's allowed. It's condensed working. Stick with the time management, that's 5 marks. But before starting, stick with the allocated time, 5 marks. You have 7 minutes to draft your answer. Just before starting the course, start drafting. Make sure that you have already brainstormed the key ideas, key points. Number 1, with this question, if we are going to attempt this question, what the key points, key technical points we need to write here. Number 1, we will always start very basic, the basics of impairment rules. For example, asset is impaired or the disposal group is impaired if its carrying amount exceeds the recoverable amount, and make some explanation of the recoverable amount. Higher or fair value less cost to sale or value in use. Very basic, and catch one mark. Always start with very basic with your own wordings. Start your momentum, catch easy marks. Then you move towards the explanation of cash generating unit. Yes, subsidy is a cash generating unit. Cash generating unit and goodwill allocation. Cash generating unit and goodwill allocation. Cash generating unit means the smallest group of assets which generate cash flows independently, like this. And finally, our case says that here goodwill we have calculated with the subsidy. It's based on proportionate method. So whenever we are calculating the impairment, we are testing the impairment, and if we identify the impairment loss. So for that calculation, first to identify the carrying amount, we need to gross up the goodwills. Then calculate the or compare the impairment. Compare with carrying amount or the recoverable amount and identify the impairment. So these 3 points, that's good enough to get the 5 marks. If I say that, if you are going to start your answer, so yes, you will work with the spreadsheet. So whatever you have planned, stick with the plan, with the time and the brainstorm, the points you have identified with the brainstorm. For example, start with impairment basic rules. Asset is impaired with the, if a carrying amount exceeds the recoverable amount, explanation of the recoverable amount. Then move towards the CGU. For example, make a reference of IS 36. IS 36 requires impairment test by comparing the carrying amount of the cash generating unit with the recoverable amount. An explanation about cash generating unit, as well as you have to mention that goodwill is not an asset which generate cash flow independently. So we need to allocate the goodwill. We need to incorporate the goodwill or allocate the goodwill with the relevant cash generating units. And then move on with the NCI proportionate. In this case, the NCI proportionate method, where we need to grossing up the goodwill to identify the carrying amount. So here, if you work out with the basic impairment rule, you will get 1 mark. CGU and goodwill allocation point, you will be able to get 2 marks. And if you mention the complication of NCI proportionate method with the grossing up, you will be able to get 2 marks. Finally, I am sharing you suggested answer. This is not exactly the model answer. This is the suggested answer crafted by me, Hussain Qazi, for your convenience, for the sake of your convenience. So for example, that is part A2, plan key points. That key points means brainstorming. And this is what about the suggested answer. Start with the impairment basic rule. That's asset is impaired if the carrying amount exceeds recoverable amount. Then we make a quick explanation. Recoverable amount is higher of fair value less cost to sell, and make a quick explanation of value in use. If you just even, it all depends the availability of the time. If you are rushing with the time, you can ignore the explanation of the value in use. That's enough to mention that asset is impaired if carrying amount exceeds the recoverable amount, and the recoverable amount is the higher of fair value less cost to sell or value in use. Then move on. CGU and goodwill allocation. 2 marks. IS 36 requires impairment test taken place comparing CGU with recoverable amount, carrying amount of CGU with recoverable amount. Then explain CGU. Then discussion about goodwill cannot be sold separately, so at no fair value. So goodwill must be allocated with the cash generating unit part, and then incorporate NCI as a proportionate method, so you need to gross up the things. But students, very important thing, start with impairment, goodwill allocation. This is what about the knowledge. But whenever you are writing or drafting the NCI proportionate point as a knowledge, you also need to incorporate the application point, because with the case here using exhibit 1, very categorically mentioned that here NCI at proportionate method. So you need to mention the name of trailer, you need to mention the grossing up, that's 20 over 80. That's called application. So read the wordings. A complication will arise since goodwill of trailer. Once you mention the name of the company, that means you have communicated to the examiner that yes, I am applying with the case. Was calculated by measuring NCI at acquisition at proportionate share of the fair value subsidiaries identifiable net asset. This means that no goodwill has been attributed to NCI, so goodwill figures need to be grossed up 100 over it for the purpose of conducting impairment test. These two bold items actually reflecting the application. Now, at the final part of this video is about, we have done the suggested answer, examiner report. What examiner says, what the complaint that's made by examiner here, this point 8, these some blue points, it's about complaint by examiner. Part A2, number 1, no calculation were needed. Candidates who knew the impairment reviews process scored well. Marks were available for description of the impairment process and for explaining that goodwill requires annual impairment review. More specifically for goodwill, answer should have discussed how goodwill cannot be sold separately. It's not independent. So must be allocated to CGU. That is what the examiner expectation. Very important. Better candidates. What examiner says about a better candidates, you should be a better candidate. You should be part of better candidates. Then apply their knowledge to the scenario that we discussed here at the last NCI proportionate. So weaker answer, weaker here, veered away from the requirement. That's you are if you are going to draft your answer other than the requirement. For example, providing list of impairment indicators. Veered away means you actually ignored or not able to understand exactly the requirement, and you have if you start drafting about listing of impairment indicators, so that means you haven't answered the question according to the examiner expectation, or I must say the answer is not relevant. So weaker answer veered away from the requirement by providing list of impairment indicators. This was not asked for and gained no marks. So students, I hope that you are getting valuable insights by reading or by understanding the examiner expectation. I hope this will benefit to you for your upcoming exam. Thank you very much about this part of the video. Wait for the another video where we will discuss agenda number 5. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.